Today's tutorial is part 2 of our complete editorial retouch. So in part 1 of our editorial retouch, we looked at some of the more distracting elements in our image. So first we started off with correcting the background and evening out tones. We then moved on to correcting holes in the tassels here in the dress. There was a tag that we had to remove, and then we finished up with some liquefying to help the fit of the dress a little bit more. In part 2, we're going to be looking at some of the more typical retouching issues. So we'll start off with the skin retouching, using primarily dodging and burning. I will use a little bit of healing and we'll take a look at that, but primarily dodge and burn to correct and even out some skin tones as well as even out areas in the dress, maybe minimize this shadow and highlight here. And then possibly go into some positive dodging and burning to bring back some contrast that we may have lost. We'll then go into some of the more atypical retouching steps, the finishing steps, levels, color matching if necessary. We'll see after we get to that point if there is a color difference between the top of our skin tones and the bottom of our skin tones like there is now. We'll also look at color toning our image if necessary, and then finish up with some sharpening and possibly adding some noise. So let's go ahead and get started. Now I want to remind you guys that some parts of the retouching, just like in part 1, will be a little bit tedious. When we get to those parts, we'll fast forward just to save time. Alright, so to the skin, and let's zoom in a little bit and take a look at what we're dealing with. So I'll turn this off. Okay, so I'm going to heal out some of these areas, just the small texture areas. I'm actually going to not use frequency separation for this, so you guys can see that you don't have to use frequency separation. It's something that I'm trying to get away from more and more, and really if you're really good with dodging and burning, you won't have to use frequency separation unless there are some more difficult or major issues. So let's go ahead and create a blank layer here. And then we can grab our healing brush tool. I use the healing brush, not the spot healing brush. The difference is with the healing brush, I can select my sample point. So by holding down Option on my keyboard, I'm using a Mac, I can sample the texture that I want to borrow and then paint in. Remember that we do want current and below selected. Since we're on a blank layer, if we have current selected, then it won't sample anything. So you can see I can sample and paint and nothing's going to happen because I'm sampling the current blank layer. So current and below. I'm also going to add my darkening curves adjustment. So just like in video 1, this is an adjustment layer that I use regularly just to allow me to see a little bit better. So I always wind up deleting it at the end, but I turn it on so I can see a little bit more information in certain areas. So let's go ahead and start healing some of these texture areas. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop there with my healing. There are definitely some areas that still need to be addressed, but I want to do as much as possible with my dodging and burning. Now, after I've done my dodging and burning, if I still find some issues, I'll have no problem going back with my healing brush to correct those. In reality, when I am retouching, I usually am going back and forth between things. I recommend not trying to get everything done at once. Don't try to do everything with one frequency separation or everything with one pass of healing or dodging and burning. If you do that, you're more likely to make mistakes or push too far. And if you just do slow, subtle builds, you'll have a lot more control. So I'm going to turn this off and take a look at my image. I can see where tones need to be corrected. So you can see there's a little shadow here. This is an area that's a little bit lighter, a little bit darker. So all these areas where maybe the tones aren't as smooth and they kind of jump out, So you can see this little shadow here. This is darker, this is darker. We're going to correct that with dodging and burning, and I use my curves to do so. So I'm going to start with dodging. So I'll go to my curves, and I'll just select a point somewhere in the middle and pull up a little bit. I'm going to make sure my curve is still selected. Hit Command I on my keyboard to invert my selection. That's going to hide my adjustment from my image, and then I can paint in where I want to affect my my image. So I'm going to grab my brush tool, turn my flow down to about 3%, my opacity back up to 100%. That's usually where I start. I am going to be painting with a soft brush. So when I'm healing, anything doing with texture, I'm always using a hard brush. But for everything else, I use a soft brush. And then I'll just go ahead and slowly build and paint in. Now, keep in mind, I still have my darkening layer on. So this is what the image really looks like right now. This is it just a little bit darker to help us see. And I'll make small adjustments. Another thing that I recommend when you're doing this is to dodge and burn from different levels, meaning different vantage points. So zooming in to see more micro transitions, so small areas like that, but then also zooming out so you can see the larger areas. You're not going to get a great skin tone, a great dodge and burn if you're only looking at one level. So where I may have been able to see this a little bit better zoomed in, I would not have seen issues like this guy here, or this guy here, or maybe this over here. So I'll be zooming in and out as I'm dodging. All right, so let's take a little break and take a look at what we've done so far. A lot of times with dodging and burning, you won't really notice that you've done anything until you turn it off. So let's go look at before and after. So this is before our dodge and after, before and after. And with our darkening curve layer on, let's take a look at it as well. So it's before and after, before and after. So you can just see that we're starting to smooth out these tones without really changing the nature of our overall skin tones. Right, so smoothing out the values, maintaining the tones. And so one little key that I recommend and that I do regularly is as I'm dodging, I'll undo and redo real quickly. And when I undo and redo, if it looks like, so let's do something real quick. So let's say if I dodge right here, what I'm actually trying to do is get something to disappear. So if I undo it and it pops back up, then I know I'm doing a good job. If I've gone too far, something like that, then you can see it actually looks better when I undo it. So that's the key there. And so I'll regularly undo to see if it actually disappears, which is what I'm trying to accomplish. So now that I've done some dodging, I'm going to go ahead and do some burning as well. And so I'll look at areas that I might want to darken. So I might want to darken underneath the eye, some of these highlights in here. And so I'll do the same thing. I'll go into curves. I'll pull down from the center just a little bit. That looks good. I'll hit Command I on my keyboard to hide that adjustment. And then I can paint in wherever I want things to be a little bit darker. So underneath the eye, just trying to blend in. So I don't want to change the image. I just want to blend the tones from here to here. Now before and after, just trying to blend in a little bit. All right, so I think that's a good first pass of dodging and burning. And let's just kind of go through all of these. If you watched, even though it's in fast forward, you can see that I'm regularly adding curves layers. I don't want to go too far with one thing. That way, if I don't like what I've done, I can simply undo that one layer. And also, since I'm building, using my flow to build my brush, a lot of times I'll max out without really knowing it, and I just want to continue to build on the effect that I'm doing. That's part of the reason why when I do this, it's very slight changes to my curve. So let's undo all these curves and take a look at everything that we've done. Okay, so just one at a time, and you can start to slowly see the change in our image to where we are now. And again, I may go back and still do some changes, but I think we've already made a pretty significant change in our image. So I'm going to select all these by holding down Shift as I select my layers, hitting Command G to group those, and again, before and after. Before and after. And it's a pretty big change. Again, it doesn't seem that way as we're working, but when you completely turn it off, you can see what a change we've made. So really evening out a lot of these tones, and then I spent a lot of time lightening this side. My fill light wasn't high enough in this image, so my main light is coming from here, as you can probably see from the catch light. My main light was focused on the clothing, so it's about here, which is why we wind up with this. My fill light is about right here, which is why this shadow side is a little bit darker than I'd like it to be. So we're correcting that now and evening that out a little bit. Okay, so that's looking good. So we can get into some of our other steps. We've done our dodge and burn, so we can drop that layer. And now we can look at our levels, color matching, toning, and sharpening. So first, let's go ahead and add a levels adjustment to really see where we are with our image. So I'm going to go down to my layers panel, down to my adjustment layer, and choose levels. And that'll pop up. We can see that there are significant gaps in our histogram. So from here to here, there really is no highlight information. So I want to pull that up. I usually judge first by the histogram and then by my eye. So if I come up to this point and it's too bright, then I'll pull back. So it is a little bit too bright, so I'm going to stop at about 230. About there looks good. And then I want to pull this up so that there's some shadows. Don't want too much. Is a lighter image. So even if we go to there, you can see where there's just a little bit of shadow information. It's way too much. So that's why I say start with your histogram and then judge by your eye. And I like things about here. You should stay away from my midpoint, but let's just take a look. All right, so that is 0. I might open that up a little bit. 108. Bring in a little bit more shadow. And before and after, before and after. I'm going to check my luminosity and see if that is affecting my saturation at all. It is a little bit, but I don't mind it, so I'm going to go back to normal. So if you ever do a level or curve adjustment and your saturation is really affected and it's too saturated, then you can go down to luminosity, and it will only affect the luminosity and not the saturation. And you also have the option of doing one that would be at normal and one at luminosity, and changing both of them to 50% if you just want to kind of hedge your bets or split the difference. All right, so that looks good. And then we can go into our next step, which is color matching. So let's take a look. I still do see a difference. So you can see there's a little bit more red in this than there is here, a little bit more yellow. These are still darker than here, and I may do some selective dodging yet again. But for now, let's try to select this or adjust the color shade difference or the color tone difference from here to here. So there's a bunch of different ways you can do that. In this tutorial, I'm just going to use Hue and Saturation, which is one of the more simple methods. Now, I'm not going to do the master hue, and I'm actually not going to jump right into, say, my reds or yellows, although I most likely most of this is going to be in the reds. I'm going to grab this slider, and I'll just select the area that I want to change. And you can see here, it jumped into yellows actually, and this is the color range that it is going to affect. I'm going to grab the plus so I can add to that color range, and you can see that it extended there into more reds. So there's more yellow here, there's more red here, and I'll just click around to make sure that everything that I want to affect, that entire color range, is selected. So when we look here, we can see there's some red, there's some yellow, and there is some green, which we can see in here. And now we can kind of change the hue here. So let's see what we need to do. It's going to be too much green. That's going to be too much red. Okay, so you can see that's a little bit better. What we basically did is got some of this red out in the leg. So where this didn't have quite as much red in the tone, this had a little bit more. So just removing some of that red to match up the tone a little bit. There's probably still a little bit too much green in here, and so we'll tweak that a little bit. I'll pull down the opacity. And then I want to add to my selection here and add this hand in because it's also in that same vein of being a little bit too red. Alright, so that's looking better. Before and after. Before and after. Very subtle change, but it helps remove some of the redness from the legs. Alright, so now we'll look at possibly color toning. So I'm going to go into selective color, which is what I use almost primarily for my color toning. I'll sometimes use a gradient map. I'm going to go into my whites, neutrals, and blacks most of the time. Now, based on the nature of this image and this editorial, there wasn't a lot of color toning. What I am going to do is go into the blacks and just add in a little bit of blue here. So I'll pull back the yellows, pull up the cyan, just to add a little bit of a color tone there. Take a look at my neutrals and see if we want to warm those up. Alright, so I think that's looking good. I'll pull that back about 10% to about 90% so we don't go too far. And then we can get into our sharpening as well as adding in some noise. So I'm going to go ahead and dump my darkening curves layer. I'm going to go ahead and hit Command Shift N to create a new layer, and then Command Shift Option E to create a stamp visible. I'm going to create a copy of that, a couple of copies, and then I'm going to use my frequency separation steps to do my sharpening. So filter, blur, Gaussian blur. I'm not going to blur too much because that's going to affect my sharpening, and we don't want to over sharpen. Go back into the above layer, and then image, apply image, and we want to select the blur layer, invert, add radius of 2, and then you can see we have our high pass layer. I'm going to delete layer 17 copy, which was our blur layer, and go into linear light. Alright, so let's zoom in and take a look and see if this is too much sharpening. So before and after, I think that looks okay. I'll pull back. And I'm going to pull this out of the highlights so it's only affecting the darker areas, which is where usually you'll find edges anyway. So I'll just pull this back using my blend if, and then just blend it a little bit so it's a smooth transition. And now this layer will only affect the darker areas, and so the highlights won't be quite as affected. Gives it a slightly more natural look. All right, so that looks good. And then if we were ready, now there's a few more things I'll probably go back and just kind of tighten up on the image, some of the dodging and burning, maybe lighten up little areas like here in the hair and everything else, maybe lighten up the legs so that these values match a little bit better to here. But if I were done, I would go and create another stamp visible. So Command Shift N, Command Shift Option E, and then filter, noise, add noise, Gaussian, monochromatic, and I think about 4 or 5% is good. Zoom in. So you can see that how the noise is helping us to blend in some of those tones. Makes things a little bit smoother, a little bit better when we go to print. Okay, and so that's looking good. So that concludes our editorial retouch, part 1 and part 2. If you guys have any questions, please reach out either on F-Stoppers or on our YouTube channel. And remember to subscribe to get updates on future videos.